Hello everyone. So this is my English law channel. Welcome, and there's going to be another talk about public law, particularly about the executive. So it's not easy to spell out exactly what the executive is, but this is the Prime Minister, the cabinet ministers, and so on. Those who are able to give orders to execute something. It doesn't mean execute a person, as in kill someone. People get a bit confused by that. So execute the order means do it. I used to have a calculator, and there's a button you say execute, as in do the calculation. So the civil service, they're part of the executive too, to some extent. The mayor of London, various directly elected mayors are like that. So it formulates policy and sort of enacts policy. So this is really the core of the state. So the powers that the Prime Minister possesses and cabinet ministers don't come from statute, which might be considered a little bit surprising. So Walter Bagehot, in his English constitution, said that there are dignified parts of the constitution and efficient parts of the constitution. So the efficient part is the executive, as it functions. Really, the monarchy is the dignified part. I've already looked at the monarchy and crown prerogative and so on. Confusing thing is that the executive, the prime minister, the cabinet ministers, they're often employing the royal prerogative. They're exercising it on behalf of the monarch. So the Parliament elected in 2010 looked into many such matters about the executive. There was a select committee which was examining the role of the Prime Minister and the extent of his or her remit. There was a Political and Constitutional Reform Select Committee which drew up a report about it, and they had the following to say: there is no constitutional definition of the Prime Minister's role or of any authoritative specification of the officer's functions, powers and responsibilities. They're a matter of convention and usage, not statute, and are thus to a large degree flexible and subject to change and variation over time. So it's rather uncertain, and that's so typically British, not in a good way. So the Prime Minister could unduly extend his remit, and that could imperil democracy if he or she were becoming overmighty. So it's something which has evolved. The Prime Minister has acquired various competences piecemeal. So anyway, there's also this convention of the Prime Ministers in Parliament, and since the 1920s, it's always been the House of Commons. You go back before that, was in the House of Lords most of the time. So yes, the Queen has the prerogative to appoint and dismiss Prime Ministers, but the convention says that she is going to pick someone who can command the support of the House of Commons. But what if she didn't abide by the convention? What if she broke that and went ahead and appointed someone outside Parliament, appointed me, of all people? What would we do? There would be no law against it. And would courts say that actually, because it was judicial review, we're going to step in and convention is law? That would be an innovation. But wouldn't it be better if the United Kingdom put her house in order and actually made these things statutes so there was clarity? Because it's all just so foggy. Anyway, so the Prime Minister is obviously the head of government of the United Kingdom, and people often describe this role as being the primus inter pares, first among equals. Why do we use the Latin for it? Anyway, so and usually the Prime Minister is also Minister for the Civil Service. So the Prime Minister has extensive powers. And some of these include powers of patronage, the ability to promote people and to dismiss them. So now this allows him or her to forge alliances with other MPs and have ministers who are on board with his or her programme, what they're trying to accomplish. So they can set up new departments, government departments, they can merge two departments, they can declare that a department of government is now defunct, and so on. So in 2020, Boris Johnson, he fused two government departments, the Department for International Development and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So it became the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Anyway, so we know that there is a cabinet as well, and that is a matter of convention too. So there are certain departments which are always there. There's the Home Secretary, represent the Home Office, the Foreign Secretary represent the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Chancellor Exchequer, using charging countries money. Chancellor of the Exchequer, we usually just say Chancellor for short. There's the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. Don't ask me what the difference between him and the Chancellor of the Exchequer is. And the Treasury is really the department of the Chancellor of the Exchequer is running. In most countries, we call it the Ministry of Finance. So, there used to be others like Lord Chancellor is there, but he is usually Secretary of State for Justice as well. So Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice is sort of a double title. Education Secretary, Health Secretary, Transport Secretary, Environment Secretary, as in the area they're in charge of. Doesn't mean Secretary is the person answering the phone, doing the emails and greeting visitors at the door to the building. A secretary can mean a very high up executive in this case. So there are roughly 25 government ministers. So anyway, what else I point out? So the cabinet meets, and there's collective cabinet responsibility, having to defend government policy in public. And if you find that unconscionable, you must resign from the cabinet. So you sit there so long as you retain the confidence of the Prime Minister. The PM can sack you at will. So there are other people's, the Attorney General, who's effectively the government solicitor, the Solicitor General, who's like the government's solicitor. The Attorney General is the government's barrister, I was meaning to say, and the Chief Whip, whose proper title is the Parliamentary Secretary of the Treasury. The Chief Whip's in charge of parliamentary discipline, trying to make sure that people in that party, those MPs, actually vote for the government's programme, because if too many rebel, then they're not going to lose. There's a Conservative government at the moment, and if lots of Conservative MPs voted against what the Conservative leadership wanted, the Conservative leadership would have their legislation blocked. It wouldn't get through the House of Commons. Now, that's pretty unlikely because they've got such a healthy majority. But there are times when it's more difficult, like, say, when Theresa May was in office just last year, because the Conservatives were a minority government, had the support of the Democratic Unionist Party, 10 of them. If even a handful of Conservative MPs rebelled, and happened quite a lot actually, her legislation was blocked, unless, of course, you got a lot of support from amongst the opposition parties, Labour, Scottish National Party, and the Liberal Democrats. And that's why Theresa May suffered 3 humiliating defeats trying to get her flagship Brexit bill through. So remember, a bill is a proposal for a law. When it's in Parliament, is only an act. It becomes an act when it's actually passed. So how many ministers can be in the House of Commons? Well, the House of Commons Disqualification Act 1975 says only 95, because remember, there are roughly 25 cabinet ministers, and they each have 2 or 3 junior ministers. Now, there can be ministers in the House of Lords as well. So there are also parliamentary private secretaries. These are MPs who are sort of holding the handbag of a cabinet minister. But they are usually, they vote with the government. Now, we often talk about the payroll vote, as in those who get extra salaries. All MPs get a certain salary, including the Prime Minister. But if you have other jobs, you get an extra salary on top of that. The Prime Minister gets more money for being PM. All the cabinet ministers get a big salary for being in the cabinet. Junior ministers get an extra salary, not so big, for being junior ministers. But the parliamentary private secretaries, PPS, do not. Anyway, but being that's sort of the cursus honorum. First step is being an MP. If your party's in office, the next step is being a being a PPS, parliamentary private secretary. The next step up is being a junior minister. The next step is being a cabinet minister. And within the cabinet, there are the 3 great officers of state: Chancellor of the Exchequer, Foreign Secretary, and Home Secretary. And so those are just below the Prime Minister. There's a Deputy Prime Minister if the Prime Minister chooses to appoint one, but usually they don't. The very first one was Clement Attlee, appointed in 1942 as part of the wartime coalition. Churchill, Conservative Prime Minister, Attlee, a Labour man, the Deputy Prime Minister. That was an innovation, but to show the unity of the British parties during the war. And most Prime Ministers have chosen not to have a Deputy PM. There hasn't been one since Nick Clegg in 2015, and again that was part of a coalition. So let's look at the civil service. These people do the paperwork of government. They're working government offices, organising things. You should see Yes Minister about that. So there was a report of the Committee on Civil Service in 1966, and this is what they said about the civil service. A civil servant is a servant of the Crown, other than holders of political or judicial offices, who is employed in a civil capacity and whose remuneration is paid wholly and directly out of monies voted by Parliament. So that's what a civil servant is. And they're not military people, that's why I've got civil in there. So the civil service works for whoever is in government, furthering their policies, and they're apolitical. They have whatever views, we don't know, they tend to keep them to themselves. And we know that we have a Conservative government, Labour government can come to office one day, and civil servants, they do their level best to implement a policy, even if they totally disagree with it, or even if they completely agree with it. So that's how our government really functions, to be working slickly when there's the government changes its political hue. So the civil service is permanent. It's a career. You can join at 18, can be there to the day you retire. So long as you keep your snout clean, you will be there to the day you retire, unless you choose to leave. It's meant to be apolitical. You do your level best for whatever governing party there is. And on what is often anonymous, as in the name of the civil servant working on this and that is not revealed. However, some civil servants or the head civil servant of the department, those are known. There's a cabinet secretary, and he or she, it hasn't been a she so far, is the head of the civil service and attends cabinet meetings. But again, it's meant to be neutral in these matters, just giving frank and disinterested advice about, is this viable, foreseeing any potential obstacles, and so on. That's that. They work for the United Kingdom as a whole, not for Labour or the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats or the SNP. So there's a civil service code which elucidates the ethics which are required of civil servants, and these are integrity, honesty, objectivity, and impartiality. So mustn't be trying to enrich yourself out of it, mustn't be lying to politicians or to the public, and must be dispassionate. Further, is not trying to help one party or harm another. So there was the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, which said, which made sure that there was a statute regulating the civil service. It wasn't just on a sort of honour code anymore. It was previously controlled through the Crown prerogative. Okay, so let's look at political accountability and contrast that and indeed ministerial accountability. So in the executive, every one of the executive is in the Commons or the Lords, mostly in the House of Commons, and so there's this doctrine of ministerial accountability, and they are responsible to Parliament. They have to go there and answer questions, be scrutinised. So that's what the Westminster model is about. So remember our old friend Walter Bagehot of the English Constitution, who wrote that in the 1860s. He said that this almost fusion between the executive branch and the legislative branch is the efficient secret of the British Constitution. He thinks it's great. But Lord Hailsham, a Conservative politician in 1978, he said the UK system was an elective dictatorship. Well, he was moaning about it possibly because he was a Conservative under a Labour government at the time, which is performing abysmally. Now, anyway, it's probably not as bad as an elective dictatorship, and it's probably not as splendid as Bagehot would have us believe. So yes, we know there's an executive in Parliament, and its powers are restricted through statute and through conventions. So let's look at this a bit more. So there's a ministerial code saying what ministers can and cannot do to behave ethically. And there's another document called Questions of Procedure for Ministers, which was published in 1992. It was updated as the Ministerial Code in 1997. So the Ministerial Code is issued again every time a new government comes into office. Suppose Labour wins in 4 years' time, it'll be issued again. So it doesn't change very much. It has to be updated just occasionally. So what does it say these days? It says, the principle of collective responsibility requires that ministers should be able to express their views frankly, in the expectation they can argue freely in private while maintaining a united front. So when the cabinet meeting saying, we think there should be another lockdown, some cabinet ministers say, no, that's a bad idea. They say, no, it's a really good idea. But once a decision is made, they must publicly defend that. And if you're not willing to speak up for government policy, you get the sack. Because otherwise the government will be all over the place, it'll be undermining discipline, the public will be confused. And that's the government ministers, cabinet ministers, and junior ministers. Now, backbench MPs of a governing party can go against it. So remember, the House of Commons has got sort of tiers down here, the lowest level. There's the Prime Minister and the governing party on this side of the aisle, and the leader of the opposition and their MPs on the other side of the aisle. But then there's a bank of seats up again, and these are backbenchers because they're further back and up, and there's another row of seats, so it goes up in 3 levels. So the front benches are the governing side, the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers, and the backbenchers might be some junior ministers and just backbench MPs. And on the opposition side, the leader of the opposition and the shadow cabinet. Because remember, there's the Chancellor Exchequer and there's the shadow Chancellor Exchequer. There's the Home Secretary and the shadow Home Secretary. The Education Secretary, the shadow Education Secretary. The shadow cabinet is of the main opposition party. They're looking at how the government is functioning, and they're critiquing what they're doing, trying to expose their mistakes. And the shadow cabinet is also formulating the policies of the opposition party, writing their manifesto so that when the election comes, if they win, they can go straight into government. If I'm the shadow transport secretary, I've been studying transport for a few years, and I can take over as transport secretary, hit the ground running because I know my brief, and I've studied the policies carefully. So you're marking your opposite number like in a sport. So anyway, it's the Prime Minister who is meant to ensure that this ministerial code is abided by the ministers, abided by. Anyway, a bit of a mouthful. And there's a similar ministerial code in Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland. I know this is the law of England and Wales. Okay, Wales comes in there, but then probably the confusing thing is sometimes we're looking at the United Kingdom as a whole. Now, England's got 83% of the population of the United Kingdom, so people sometimes allied England and the United Kingdom. Anyway, so some prime ministers say, well, you've got to resign, and people usually do. If they don't, they'll be sacked. Some ministers resign on principle because they can't abide government policy. Anyway, so you see, this is how these conventions work. But collective cabinet responsibility, it has been suspended on a number of occasions. So we know that there's a collective cabinet responsibility to vote yes for a motion of confidence, to have discussions in confidentiality. If you dissent from government policy, you could argue out amongst the ministers, try and persuade the Prime Minister, other cabinet ministers to change their mind, but you don't go blabbing to the press. Some of them break that, and they give these off-the-record briefings to a journalist saying, don't tell a soul it was me, but the policy's rubbish. And then unanimity. So in public, they're all voting in favour of government policy. Now, there are free votes on issues of conscience to do with, like, say, abortion or gender reassignment. These aren't party political issues that's in our manifesto. We're going to do this or that. Collective cabinet responsibility has been suspended thrice over Catholic emancipation in the 1820s by Lord Liverpool, 1975 over the referendum to remain in the European Economic Community, and in 2016 over the Brexit referendum. Anyway, so confidence. So sometimes the government must resign. They've lost a motion of confidence, or they want to vote for an early election. That's a bit different. Kind of constructive vote of no confidence, you could call it. So if there's the governing party is defeated in the House of Commons on a vital issue of policy, that would be regarded as a loss of a vote of no confidence. But again, that's a convention, that's not a law. That one about losing a key vote, how important is it before it's key? Theresa May wrote some really important votes, and that wasn't seen as a loss of confidence. But if there is a no confidence motion, that's that, and that actually is in statute. Remember, but there was an attempt to have a no confidence vote in the Prime Minister, Theresa May. January 2019, there was a motion of no confidence in her, but she won by 19 votes, partly because the Democratic Unionist Party was on her side. Okay, unanimity. What's that about? All being on the same page. So that means that the government must all sing from the same hymn sheet, because if the government's squabbling amongst itself, it looks dreadful, and indeed it is dreadful, so it undermines them. So junior ministers are often not involved in the discussions of policy formulation, but they have to go along with them, otherwise they're going to be sacked. So confidentiality. This is the idea that certain debates within cabinet and even rows within cabinet have to be kept quiet. You don't go washing your dirty linen in public. And there was a leading case on this, Attorney General and Jonathan Cape Limited in 1976. Jonathan Cape is a publishing house. It was Crosman, Richard Crosman, a Labour cabinet minister, publishing embarrassing information, and it came before the Queen's Bench Division courts. Anyway, so how does this operate under a coalition government? There was one not so long ago, Conservatives and Liberal Democrats, and sometimes the Prime Minister said, okay, we're just going to hold this confidentiality principle or in abeyance for a while, that we agree to disagree about certain issues for a particular period of time. Anyway, so there are free votes, which I mentioned earlier, and they're not whipped because the whips, as in MPs in charge of party discipline, both in the opposition party and in the governing party, they would say there's a one-line whip. We request you go and vote the way our party leadership tells you to. Two-line whip, we encourage you to do so, and three, we order you to do so. And if you vote against your party in a three-line whip, the whip can be withdrawn. You no longer remember the parliamentary party. They're not actually expelled. The Honourable Nicholas Soames, he had the whip withdrawn in 2019 for voting against the party in a three-line whip about Brexit. He had the whip restored for the last couple of weeks before he left Parliament. He bowed out. Anyway, let's look at ministerial responsibility. So the minister's personal behaviour, even outside the political sphere, is part of it. If you do something that's really disreputable, you could be sacked from the cabinet or as a junior minister. But there's also your constitutional responsibility. You are answerable for what goes on in your government department. Now, sometimes things goes wrong. It's not really their fault. But people say it's the only way to make sure they keep their eye on the civil servants. Or let's say in Northern Ireland, there was a big breakout for the Maze prison. A lot of dangerous terrorists got out on the streets, and the Northern Ireland Secretary resigned. Now, he wasn't a prison officer. It wasn't his fault that these people got out of jail. But anyway, he fell on his sword. These principled resignations. Lord Carrington in 1982, the Falklands was invaded. The Foreign Secretary resigned. Was that big of him, or was that completely unnecessary? We thought someone had to carry the can. Anyway, so you're answerable for what goes on in your department as a cabinet minister or junior minister. So anyway, these accepting failings in your department and resigning on that basis have become increasingly rare over time. But at the very least, they have to be in Parliament, and they will be questioned and asked to explain what's going on, to inform the public, to say sorry, to rectify the wrongdoing. There was this sort of whole Windrush scandal where some black British citizens were deported illegally. They had the absolute legal right to be in the United Kingdom. Other people who weren't citizens but been residents of the UK for decades, they were sometimes had various rights withdrawn, were threatened with deportation when they shouldn't have been, despite their decennial presence in the UK. So there's a difference between operational and policy matters to be drawn, because government is very, very complicated. And so some matters are put in the hands of bureaucrats, or even in quangos, quasi-autonomous non-government organisations, next steps agencies like the Highways Agency or something. And so the minister has got so little control over those. Those are a few stages removed from him. He or she is not expected to resign if things really screw up there. But there are also policy matters, and he or she has helped shape policy. And if that goes wrong, they be booted out. Now, there's also the Carl Toner principle to bear in mind. And this principle is one that is about how government operates these days. It relates to a case called Carl Toner Limited and Commissioners of Works, 1943. But I think I won't go into that one. That's a bit too complex. Okay, so I hope you've learned a few things from this brief video, and perhaps you note down some of the key terminology from this very brief introduction to how the law touches on the executive. So I really need donations to keep the channel going, so please donate to me on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Book online lessons with me in law and loads of other subjects. Thank you. Good night.